Hello, good evening, and it's fantastic to see so many people here and so many people who were at our first Earth Convention, which we did about energy not that long ago. And tonight we're going to be, as you know, talking about oceans and rivers, and it is great to see you all. Once again, I'd just like to express my deep gratitude to Rathbones and in particular to Greenback, which is their sustainable arm for finance. And my gosh, do we need you now? So please keep doing the fantastic work that you're doing, and we're delighted to work with you on this series. Oceans tonight are obviously very, very topical. For those of you who've been following, last week in Nice was the United Nations Conference on the Oceans, and they said the ocean is finally having a moment, which I think is true because we have thought about it very little, certainly not enough, as you're going to hear tonight from most of our speakers. But it won't just be about oceans. Jacques Cousteau said 50 years ago that the sea is the great unifier. It's man's only hope, and we're all in the same boat. And you could say that that's what David Attenborough did the other day when he released Oceania. And certainly you can see that everyone now suddenly has a mental image of what bottom trawling is about. It's no longer just a word, it's a visual image of damage being done. But UNOC produced some really good things, like by next year we will have a deal that will be ratified to protect 30% of our oceans, like 30% of our land. But before we get carried away on that, we've got 38 only of our 337 marine protected areas in the whole of the UK are partially or wholly protected right now today. So there is a lot of work to do. And as for rivers, well, our speaker about rivers particularly is George Monbiot, who you may have read on the subject. George and I both share a love of cold water swimming or river swimming, and there is a lot to moan about many of our favourite rivers. We'll hear more about this. And we'll hear a lot more from our panel of fantastic experts. I couldn't be more proud to be standing here about to introduce you to the following four people who bring together expertise in rivers and waters and tipping points and all manner of things to do with the water in our lives. So, afterwards, their books will be on sale in the foyer, and also out in the foyer in the map room are some amazing images of birds and sea otters and marine life painted by Beatrice Forshall, and I can tell you that they are all for sale, although I don't know the prices, but they are absolutely fantastic. So, with no further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers one by one. They're going to come up and talk, and then we'll all be sitting there, and we'll have a discussion, and then it's over to you. Please use the Slido code, put your questions in, and we'll try and come to as many as possible. So first up this evening is the amazing Helen Scales, who is the author of the acclaimed book, The Brilliant Abyss and Spirals in Time. But her most recent book is What the Wild Sea Can Be, which is a fantastic book which just got onto the shortlist for the Women's Prize for non-fiction. And as Helen and I were saying, this is such a great recognition of the importance of environment books, that shortlists like that include books like Helen's, which is very well worthwhile. And she's a teacher at Cambridge and an ambassador for Save Our Seas, as well as being the author of those books, plus lots of wonderful books for children. So please give her a big round of applause.
Thank you so much. I have 6 minutes to talk to you, and I figured the best way to make sure I say all I want without going over time is to read. I don't normally do this, but that's what I'm going to do tonight. The world's ocean is in crisis and faces interwoven threats of overexploitation, pollution, and climate change. For too long, the health of the ocean has been overlooked as a key environmental issue, partly because much of it lies out of sight, beneath the waves, beyond the horizon, and far from most people's lives. But that's now changing, and the plight and importance of the ocean is coming into sharper view. This image was taken in Antarctica in 2017 by the wildlife photographer and a good friend of mine, Stefan Christman, when he witnessed the sea ice breaking up too early during the life cycle of these emperor penguins, forcing them to climb high onto an ice shelf before realizing they had no other option but to leap into the freezing Southern Ocean to find food. This is not normal behavior. This adult, you can see here, would likely have survived that jump. This chick, fledgling chick, would not have made it. They, as you can see, haven't yet grown their life-sustaining suit of waterproof, insulating feathers. Scenes like this have been repeated many times since these pictures were taken. In some years, thousands of grey, fluffy chicks have fallen into the ocean and perished when the sea ice broke apart beneath their feet too soon. These birds are among the many ice-dependent species in Antarctica, which is one of the fastest changing regions of the ocean and plays a crucial role in global climate and weather patterns and sustaining life all through the seas. Emperor penguins are at the front line of the climate crisis, and they show how urgently action is needed. And yet, this tragic, heartbreaking story of imperiled penguins, no matter how bad that is, their fate is not sealed. What's more, emperor penguins are a barometer for global climate change. Using satellites that pass over Antarctica once a week, taking pictures, scientists can identify the dark patches of penguin colonies and the spatters of their pink guano, and they can count the emperors from space. Studies confirm that the more carbon emissions are limited and future global heating minimized, the more sea ice will remain longer into the season and the more emperor penguins there will still be. So, even in the most remote and challenging parts of our planet, people are monitoring the health of the changing ocean and reporting back on how it's doing. This kind of study and many others are helping to steer much more attention towards the blue parts of our planet. And awareness is growing that a healthy ocean is vital for the rest of life on Earth. So, as Rosie has already introduced, this week we've had world leaders gathering in Nice in France at the United Nations Ocean Conference to discuss how to better safeguard the seas. You may have seen the footage from David Attenborough's ocean documentary showing how industrial fishing is devastating ocean species and habitats. And it was indeed a huge honor to have my book about the future of the ocean as a finalist for the Women's Prize for Nonfiction. The challenge we have now is to keep building the momentum for the ocean. Solutions to reverse the threats are already available. We know what to do, including fully protecting more of the ocean, curbing the most damaging forms of fishing, capping production of plastics, and phasing out harmful chemicals. What we need now are the means and the political will to put these solutions in practice swiftly, widely, and effectively. The ocean needs to be front and center of climate discussions in the upcoming COP in Brazil this November. The ocean is not just where most of the most extreme impacts of the climate crisis are striking, but a healthy ocean is also crucial for removing carbon from the atmosphere, including in seagrass meadows and mangrove forests that we're looking at here. The good news is that there are still places in the ocean full of vibrant life. And sea life has a tremendous capacity to heal and recover, given a chance. Just look at the giant bluefin tuna returning to British seas after being gone for decades, and whale populations recovering after the end of commercial whaling and hunting. The window of opportunity to act for a healthier, more just future for the ocean is still open, but it's rapidly closing. Now, I know all too well that all of this can feel really overwhelming, so I want to just finish by bringing it back to a personal note. In writing my latest book, I found that it is entirely possible to find a balance of hope and fears for the future of the ocean. I no longer try to decide if I am either an optimist or a pessimist. I am both. I'm still enraged by what has happened so far in the ocean and scared about what there is still to come. But I feel hope. knowing that ocean life is resilient, and knowing that ever more people, no matter where they live and what they do, are caring for the ocean, feeling a sense of awe at its living wonders and taking part in being part of the undoing of its problems. The more people who identify as ocean people, the less chance there is that for the ocean will once again fall out of sight and out of mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Helen. That was really wonderful. Especially that last slide is quite magical, and it's very nice to end on an optimistic note. And I know that our next speaker has an optimistic story too. Please welcome to the stage George Monbiot, who I think is probably, okay, no stranger to anybody.
Thanks very much, Rosie, and thanks everyone for coming. So I became a vegan after I went looking for otters on the River Culm in Devon. And this is a famously wildlife-rich river. It's meant to be stuffed with otters and salmon and kingfishers and brook lamprey and stone loach and all these other wonders of the living world. When I got there, I could smell it from 50 meters away. And when I came to the bank, I saw instantly that this was a dead river, at least this stretch of a couple of miles that I'd gone to explore. There was nothing living in it except sewage fungus, which is actually a misnomer. It's filamentous bacteria, and you can see them, this sort of white, feathery bacteria waving in the stream, and that was it. Nothing else was alive in this river. And so instead of looking for otters, I went into Tintin mode and started looking for the source of this pollution. And it took a while to find it, because when you've got this eutrophication event, in other words, far too many nutrients coming into a river, the bankside vegetation goes crazy. It turns into a jungle. You have to fight your way through to try to get anywhere at all. But eventually, I found a pipe discharging into the river. Now, this was a dry day, and yet this torrent of brown filth was pouring into this beautiful river. And you could see above the pipe, there were trout, there were mayflies, there were all sorts of creatures in the water, and below the pipe, there was nothing at all. So I followed this pipe up the hill and found it led, as the smell had already told me, to a dairy farm. And that it had been built deliberately from the lip of one of the slurry lagoons down to the river. And when I looked on Google Earth, I found that about 18 months before, they had doubled the size of the livestock unit, but they hadn't increased the size of the slurry lagoons. Instead, they'd taken the cheaper option of merely building a pipe straight from the lagoon into the river. And so I did what any good citizen would do, and I rang the Environment Agency's pollution hotline and reported this riverside, this eco-side of the river that was going on. And they answered, much to my surprise, and said, oh, well, yes, sir, it sounds very serious, we'll look into it. And so I went home, and in the meantime, I published my photos and the story of what I'd found in The Guardian. So I was about the most empowered complainant there could possibly be. 2 weeks later, I phoned up the Environment Agency again and said, so how have you got on with the investigation? They said, well, thank you, sir. Yes, we went down and had a look, and we decided that we will take no enforcement action. I said, what are you talking about? They said, well, it's not a serious pollution incident. I said, what do you mean? Well, we found no evidence of a fish kill, sir. Of course you found no evidence of a fish kill. There haven't been any blinking fish living there for 18 months. How can there be a fish kill if there aren't any living fish? And they said, well, thank you for your concern, sir. Brr. So I wrote another article saying, what does a farmer have to do to get prosecuted? Detonate an atom bomb. And on the back of that, I had 2 separate whistleblowers approach me from the Environment Agency. And they said, we've been instructed from the top, from the Secretary of State for the Environment, not to enforce against dairy farmers. This is why there's no enforcement in this case, and it's the same right the way across the country. There will be no enforcement against dairy farmers, whatever they do. It's entirely incidental that the Secretary of State at the time was one Elizabeth Truss. But things have scarcely improved. You know, and one of the things I began to realize as I started investigating this was that even if you stripped out the horrendous impacts of the water industry, dumping human sewage into the rivers, almost all our rivers would still be in bad ecological condition because of the farming industry, particularly livestock factory farming. And basically, no catchment, no river can survive intensive animal farming. And the reason for this is this massive throughput of nutrients. What you're doing is sticking hundreds of dairy cattle or thousands of pigs or tens of thousands of chickens into a factory. They call it a shed, but these are massive, great steel constructions. And then you're pumping huge amounts of food from them, sucked in from North America, from Brazil, from all over the world, pumping that food through them. Some of the food, some of the nutrients stay within the animals, and a lot of them are pooped out. And then you've got an enormous disposal problem. A huge amount of manure. There are places in the country which would love to have that manure, but it's very high volume, low value. Beyond about 5 kilometers, you'd be using more diesel cost than any money you'd make by selling it, so you're going to dump it within the catchment. And because the way it works is that a processing factory will set up in a catchment and then contract farmers to provide the chickens or the pigs or the milk that that processing factory is going to use to turn into sausages or Kentucky Fried Chicken or whatever it's going to turn into, cheese, then you'll get a massive impact all at once with loads and loads of these factories being set up, and they will inexorably kill the river. Because even if they're not pumping it straight in, as the dairy farm I saw was doing, just by spreading it on the land at volumes far, far higher than the soil and the plants can absorb, inevitably a load of that poo is going to go down, it's going to flow into the river. And what we've seen happening is that these factories have been given planning permission as if they exist in isolation. The cumulative impact of all that livestock manure is not considered, or has not been until today, coming on to this, is not considered when they're assessing whether or not they should have planning permission to proceed. In other words, they do not take account of the increments of excrement. I've been wanting to say that for quite a long time. And basically that's the decision point. You know, as soon as they get permission, the death of the river is foretold. So we just have to stop this from happening. And amazingly, today, as it happens, perfectly timed entirely for this talk, this is the reason the judge made this excellent decision, a judicial review taken by a campaigner I know against chicken farms in the Welsh borders called Alison Caffin, found that it is actually against the law for councils to be giving planning permission without taking the cumulative impacts into account. So on the face of it, it's good news, but of course what it means is that we're likely to be importing a load of our farmed animal products instead. My solution is simply to stop eating them. There is just no way in which it is compatible with a thriving living planet, and particularly with thriving rivers. We have this bucolic imagery surrounding animal farming. You'll find your box of eggs, if you go to Tesco's, it'll say Willow Farms. There's no such place as Willow Farms. With these chickens clucking around in flowering meadows with butterflies. It's the exact opposite. It's a dystopian nightmare, both for the chickens and for everything downstream of them. We've just got to stop, because even if we sort out the horrendous shit show of the water companies, we've still got another horrendous shit show downstream of that in the form of intensive livestock farming. Thank you.
Thank you, George. very well organised in terms of that judgment. At least that's a very, very good bit of news. Even if it doesn't stick, it's a great piece of news. Our next speaker is Tom Mustill, and Tom's written an amazing book called How to Speak Whale, and he came up with the notion of how to learn about whales because he was in a small canoe and a whale breached on top of his canoe. It's an incredibly famous short video, which, if you haven't seen it, do watch, not right now, but watch later. And he has now become a tremendous activist around all sorts of things to do with the oceans. He's worked with David Attenborough, Greta Thunberg, Stephen Fry, and a lot of his work has been nominated, and he's also been nominated for a Primetime Emmy. And tonight he's going to be talking to us about some of the newest discoveries in the world of whales, and especially how AI is proving to be might be not a bonus in other areas, but it's turning out to be a big bonus in this area. So please welcome Tom.
Thank you very much. I should add that my favourite collaboration was actually with George. That's the film, if any of them you watch, I'd prefer you to. I'm going to tell you in this introduction a story of two cetaceans, two whales in different places that speak to change in the seas. The first clip is from the UK, from just off Peacehaven near Brighton, where I live. In January of this year, some friends of mine at the Sussex Dolphin Project said, "There's something big, and we think it's a whale. Do you want to go and see if we can find it?" And it was horrible. It was -3 degrees, and we drove out. There was only one other vessel out. It was a Welker. We found a humpback whale breaching off the coast of Brighton. What was it doing there? Why was it there? The conventional wisdom is that if a whale has made it that far up the Thames, it's lost and doomed. But on the echo sounder from the boat, we saw that the water was full of fish, sprat probably, and this whale was feeding and feeding and feeding and seemed very happy. So this story represents something that's happening in every sea, which is that unexpected whales are turning up. And this is a good story, it's an optimistic story, and it's also a scary story, because the whales are recovering from whaling, and this humpback is a young male, probably one of the ones that's expanding into the range that it used to have, but it's moving into a changing sea. And off Brighton, they haven't been dredging the shallows, so some of the seagrasses and kelp has been regenerating, so there's food there. But the grey whales, for the first time in 200 years, are now coming from the Pacific Ocean through the Northwest Passage down into the Atlantic, some even into the Mediterranean. It's not such a good story. So the world is full of moving whales following changing food, and our country sits at one of these whale crossroads. So I'm going to show you what it was like for the skipper of our boat, Kurt, who'd never seen a whale despite spending almost every day of his adult life at sea, when we found on this miserable morning this incredible whale. And one sec, I've got to cue it. Come. Yeah, we're gonna get a tail, Yeah! Beautiful! Oh yeah!
Yes! We just wanted to find out more. We wanted to know if it was in good condition, if it was entangled, or if there was any reason why it was staying in one area where they're not normally seen. But we watched it just chilling out and doing whaley stuff. Looks in good condition. We watched it breach.
Oh! Oh my God!
Orgasmic. The best thing I've ever seen in my life. That was absolutely breathtaking. Wow. Can't believe that. There he is again. There he is. Oh, yes.
They're so big, they're so charismatic. I feel very privileged to have been able to see it right off my doorstep.
So that's the first thing that's changing. Who is here? Who is in our sea? And one thing is, we don't actually know who used to be in our sea. Many of these whales were here a few generations ago, but nobody noticed them or recorded them. The second thing that's changing is who is noticing them. And that is people like you. It is not professional scientists. It's mostly normal people who go to the sea, go out in boats, stand on cliffs, and because they have phones, they can share their recordings. And the other thing is they can share those recordings and upload them online, and there's a website called Happy Whale. And the third thing is that it aggregates all the tail photographs of whales around the world. And on the way home from seeing this whale, I uploaded, the reason we were so excited was because it finally showed its tail fluke. I uploaded the tail flukes. I got a reply from Happy Whale within minutes saying this is a new whale, it's never been seen before, and then the GPS coordinates were logged, and then we watched it being, every time other people saw it, pinging on the map, and we started to piece together a picture of this whale's life. So, new whales, people like you and me finding them, and tools that allow us to understand their lives and piece them together. And this tool, Happy Whale, has been used to do something we never could do before, which was to estimate the total number of humpback whales there are. Because people are using it in every sea, in every place there are humpback whales in the world, and now we have an estimate in the Pacific for the total number of humpback whales there. So that's a massive and rapid change. Maybe you're already using some of these in your own phones. Hands up who uses Merlin, the bird? Yes? Great work. If you haven't got your hand up, use it at the end of this gathering to download Merlin for free from Cornell University. It's an AI bird identification tool. You turn it on, it starts recording, it finds patterns in the bird songs that it can pick up, and it helps you to notice and pay attention, often to birds that you cannot see. Sometimes it's wrong. The other day I was using it and it said there was a jay. It wasn't a jay. I was watching an angry squirrel shouting at me. But most of the time, it's a lot better than me. I mean, that's not saying much with birds. The second video I'd like to show you is a scoop. So I just got back from the United Nations Ocean Conference. The first people in the world to know this information were a small group of people that we told it to there. You're the second. This is a video of a whale off the island of Dominica, where Project SETI is leading the biggest ever whale recording and listening expedition. In the last 3 years, they've already recorded more sperm whale vocalizations than had ever been gathered until that point, just in this one expedition. Their goal is to try and find patterns in those vocalizations of the resident sperm whales and to see if we can begin to translate. They have already found that the whales have a phonetic alphabet that's far more complex than we realized, that they reconstitute different units of the sounds that they make to make different meaningful vocalizations that they use in specific situations. Their statistical analysis has found that they have statistical structures in their languages, in their communication system analogous to human language. They've already decoded, for instance, the signal the whales use for dive, and very interestingly, they use that signal quite a long time before they start diving, and they're so confident that they believe that the whales have something which can be called a language. And they're already trying to think about, what do you do when you translate a language? How do we give these whales an opportunity to represent themselves in our decision-making? In this video, you will see a sperm whale giving birth. It's surrounded by other whales, and you will see a flush of blood, and then the baby whale will come out. A sperm whale is born after an 18-month gestation with its tail fluke totally curled over. It's negatively buoyant. It will sink unless it is helped. It must breathe to survive. Its mother is exhausted. What do sperm whales do? There's no sound in this, but they did record the sound from under the water. So there's the flush of blood. And in a moment, you should see the calf there. So these whales David's team have discovered, using machine learning, which is just a statistical analysis tool in this case that helps draw attention to things the scientists find difficult to discern, that in this group of 12 whales, every member of the group, both kin, relatives, and non-kin, take turns without arms to carry a newborn, negatively buoyant calf on their back while the mother recovers. Whales have lived in the sea, or their ancestors, for 50 million years. To do this requires, in the words of David, and the paper's coming out in Science soon, an example of extreme empathy. You cannot do this unless you trust each other, unless you coordinate, unless you communicate. And these are the kinds of patterns that some of these new tools that help us understand the things we're seeing in the sea, like AI, are allowing us to notice for the first time. But these whales almost went extinct 50 years ago because we wrote them off as stupid fish with no feelings, no relationships, nothing of use to note apart from their utility for us. And now we know that that was rude to whales and also rude to fish. So it's an example of what we stand to lose, but our new capacity to comprehend. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank you for sharing that extraordinary video. That feels like a real privilege to have seen it. Our final panelist tonight is Professor Tim Lenton, who's Director of Global Systems at the University of Exeter, and he's Chair in Climate Change and Earth System Science. Tim was just the other day awarded an OBE, which is really well-deserved. I mean, he is the person more than anyone probably in this country who understands about tipping points, and tipping points we certainly see in the oceans in a really big way. He's here to tell us a lot more about this. Please give him a big welcome. And congratulations.
Yes, thank you for the uplifting whale tale. My little 6 minutes will be a little more depressing to begin with, but I'll try and be a bit uplifting by the end. So yes, tipping points. I mean, you can't do this on that kind of chair, but you've all played the game of leaning back at some point in your youth, perhaps, and realized that for the chair, there's a point where a small nudge one way or the other makes a big difference to your fate, whether you end up back upright or sprawled on your back on the floor. 2 different states of you in the chair. The trouble is, the whole circulation of the ocean also has 2 different states, so we definitely don't want to tip into the other one. So I want to talk a bit about that. This is a little bit subtler than just tipping over the chair. This is a system I'm forcing towards a tipping point. I'm making the state it started in, like being upright, we would say less resilient. Things that maintain the old status quo, that buffered change, are getting weaker, and things within the system that can amplify change are getting stronger. And at a tipping point, they take over. They're so strong, the amplifiers within the system, that they create a self-propelling change from one state to another. And that change is abrupt, as you saw, and it gets very difficult to reverse because it has its own momentum. And yeah, I'm honored to be honored, as it were, because I spent 20 years trying to highlight to us all the bits of the climate system, or the Earth system, or Gaia, if you prefer, that can be tipped into a different state by global warming and all the other things we're doing to the global environment. There's a few of them on this map here. There's the one kind of the target in the middle is the one I really want to talk about, the great overturning circulation of the Atlantic Ocean. But suffice to say, there are other key parts of the ocean, like the coral reefs, that are already passing tipping points as we go through 1.3, 1.4 degrees C of global warming. But that Atlantic circulation that's been slowing down already in my lifetime and yours, that's the thing that kind of connects the climate system together, as the arrows kind of hint. And if we are foolish enough to tip it, I'm going to show you how truly horrendous that would be. Not just to scare us, but to give us the right sense of urgency that we should be doing everything in our power to try and accelerate out of trouble and stop global warming in its tracks. So let's look a little bit more just at a sort of cartoon animation of how the ocean circulates. So the red currents are at the surface, they're indicating warmer water, and the blue ones are very cold, and they're at the bottom of the ocean, thousands of meters down. And if you concentrate on the Atlantic, you see a nice red current coming right from the South Atlantic all the way up, across through what we call the Gulf Stream. And then somewhere either side of Greenland, it goes red to blue. The waters of the surface ocean that have been flowing north. They've been evaporating fresh water to the atmosphere, making them saltier. They've been losing heat to the atmosphere as they head north, making them colder. Getting saltier and colder makes the water denser until it gets dense enough either side of Greenland to fall, or to convect, as we say, to sink from the top of the ocean to thousands of meters depth. And to drive this great overturning, we call it, or sometimes the conveyor belt circulation around the Atlantic. Why do we care about that? Well, in very simple terms, it's bringing a spectacular amount of heat up to where we are and giving us the nice equable maritime climate that we all enjoy. Unfortunately, Earth history tells us this thing can be tipped off, this circulation. It was tipped off and back on again 25 times during the last ice age. And what happens if it tips off for the UK? This is what happens when it does tip off in one of our climate models in a world that will be, it's 2 degrees C warmer, but we lose that overturning circulation. Well, here are some of the decadal extremes you could expect in our glorious nation. Edinburgh, minus 30 degrees C decadal extremes. London, minus 20. The numbers I put up here are relative to pre-industrial, so they're a little bit smaller than the ones I just quoted. How about the number of frozen days? Edinburgh, on top of the 30 days you'd have a month in the pre-industrial climate of frozen days, you get another 133, 5.5 months in the deep freeze for Edinburgh once a decade, or for London, two and a bit. Why is this? Because the great loss of that supply of heat has allowed the sea ice to come all the way down. By February, it's on average at the top of East Anglia, across the North Sea, surrounding Scotland. The weather extremes that come with this are horrendous. But this also doesn't save us from summer warmth. The heat waves that we expect in a warmer climate are barely dented. So the seasonality of our climate would go up extraordinarily. It would get a hell of a lot drier overall. And we did some work a few years ago to show what it would do to land use in the UK. In simple terms, I don't know if George is going to be pleased or even more dismayed about this, but it will eliminate arable farming, the ability to do it in the UK. So we'd only be left with the possibility of pasture farming on grasslands. But I pity the cattle out in those frozen winters if we haven't had the sense to stop eating them in the first place. And it's less. I mean, that looks bad, but this is because there's a water crisis going on in the country. We calculate there would not be enough water for all the people here in the southeast. There simply wouldn't be enough precipitation to get through the summers. And what happens if you step back to the global picture? Well, this is having ramifications around the world. This is what it's doing to the ability to grow major staple crops, wheat and maize. Purple is bad, dark purple is eliminating the possibility to grow these staple crops. I wouldn't take much comfort that the emperor penguins could grow some maize on the Antarctic Peninsula, because otherwise the map is alarmingly purple. In fact, the area worldwide in which you can grow these two key staple crops reduces by more than a half. So in simple terms, we'd have a water crisis. We'd have both a water crisis locally and a food crisis globally on our hands. So that's the magnitude of the kind of risks we're running if we're past this particular tipping point in the climate. It should make it blindingly obvious that we should be doing everything in our power to stop global warming, which in very simple terms means stop fossil fuel burning and also make some major changes, as we've already alluded to, in our diets. What I want to emphasize is that the good news story, if there is one, is that there are also tipping points that I'm going to call positive tipping points that can accelerate the change we need to stop the fossil fuel burning, to switch to the sources of renewable power and electrification of the economy that we need, and also potentially in the behaviors and the dietary choices of you and I. So in simple cartoon terms again, we know we're in an unsustainable state of society and the economy, but we also know that we can imagine and we can picture how it can all function in a sustainable way, and people like me spend our lives unpacking that. We actually have some concrete examples where we've already seen that action can tip key sectors of the economy and key countries to the cleaner technologies or behaviors we need to to stop climate change in its tracks. Things like the fact that the UK has tipped away from coal burning. 40% of our power supply in 2012 came from burning coal. That fell off a cliff around 2015. There were 10% year-on-year reductions in greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector in the UK. I don't think any of us notice, really, because we never think about where the electricity is coming on when we use the computer or the fridge or watch the lights on or whatever. And that was triggered by a simple policy intervention, you could say, on one level, just putting a floor price on carbon emissions in the power sector of the government and promising it would only ever be stepped up. This was enough to turn the economics of coal burning bad, and then investors start withdrawing their money, and then you get like a fire sale, other investors withdraw their money, and it amplifies, and bang, we get rid of dirty coal burning, good riddance. I could give you many other examples, but I'm sure I've used up my 6 minutes. The book I haven't published yet, coming out on the 4th of September, is where I've enjoyed digging and finding all the stories of these positive tipping points that are already happening and working out, okay, what do we need to do to make them happen, make more of them happen and make them spread worldwide? Because only that way are we going to be able to accelerate out of trouble in time to avoid those pretty horrendous tipping point risks I showed you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tim. That was sort of equally scary and equally reassuring. Well, I think possibly mostly scary when you think about how things are going. So if we do nothing, is what you set out inevitable?
As a scientist, you're not religious. You'd never say something was certain until it happens. So I'm not going to say it's inevitable. What I am going to say is every 0.1 degrees C of global warming disproportionately increases the risk of these kind of extremely damaging tipping points. So every fraction of a degree counts disproportionately. And that's why we have to accelerate action, because I didn't tell you we're going about 5 times too slowly in doing what we need to do, which we complicatedly call decarbonising the economy. But we've seen these instances of how you can accelerate by a factor of 10 the change we need by working with the feedbacks in the system in a smart way.
So, Helen, what's the role that the ocean plays in this climate stability? Because it's huge, isn't it?
I mean, it's huge. I think Tim actually is pretty better placed to answer that sort of process question, actually. And your diagram really was showing us how heat being distributed everywhere is crucial, but it isn't just heat, it's also oxygen and food and life in the ocean too. There is a crucial part, which I touched on, the idea of carbon drawdown into the ocean, and that's partly a physical thing, that the water itself is absorbing carbon emissions and taking away a huge amount of that and helping us out, as well as heat. 90% of the excess heat trapped in the atmosphere because of climate change is in the ocean. We'd be in a tremendously worse state right now. I think it's something like 30-degree heating we'd be looking at if there wasn't an ocean. So the physical presence of the ocean itself is there, and then the life itself in the ocean too is being part of that carbon capture and drawdown. The carbon cycle is hugely important, from the habitats, the green habitats, the seagrass meadows and so on, as well as species like the most abundant vertebrate on the planet are these little fish called lanternfish and bristlemouths, 2 different kinds of fish. And they go on this daily migration, nightly migration, from the deep sea to the surface. They feed at night at the surface when it's a bit safer. And then before the sun rises, they disappear back down into the great depths of the sea, taking carbon with them in their bodies that has been harnessed by algae and plankton in the surface. And so they are, we know, a really important part of the carbon drawdown. Exactly how much, we don't, we're still figuring that number out, but it is huge. And yet there are people out there who are thinking, this enormous abundance of life, we don't exploit it yet. We should be doing that. It's an underutilized resource. So let's see what we can do. So there's efforts to try and catch these fish, and then they're not very edible, so we'll just make them into food for farmed salmon and pet food and things like that, because we can make some money from it. And that could just cut off that carbon drawdown if we're not careful.
We're going to come to the audience in a very short time, so do put questions into Slido. But George, that brings us again back to diet. which is obviously, when you talk about not... What's your attitude to fish? Which I've never actually known.
At last, in Attenborough's ocean film, we've actually had a film which says what's really going on underwater. Broadcasters have been far too slow to give us that reality. People have been sitting, eating their fish dinner, saying, oh, isn't it awful? Or look at the plastic going in the sea. And, industrial fishing is an ecocide machine. It's designed to extract and kill as many living creatures as it possibly can, and never mind if a whole load of those creatures aren't even the target species. Again, we've just got to stop. And it's very hard to see how we can reconcile eating animals with anything remotely approaching supporting our life support systems. Yeah. It just doesn't work. Sadly, I would love it if we could make it work, but it really doesn't. And we have these farcical marine protected areas. The government is now saying that finally it will get round to banning bottom trawling in half of them, which means that the remaining half are protected in name only. They're just lines on a map. And what I would love to see is the default position changing, this is the argument put forward by Deborah Rowan Wright, who says that the default position in the sea should be no exploitation. And maybe we could carve out a few small areas where there's certain forms of exploitation are licensed and allowed. But at the moment, the default position is exploitation, and we carve out a few tiny areas where some forms of exploitation are not allowed. We should reverse that.
Absolutely. I mean, Tom, the whole citizen science approach to what's in the sea, in the whales, I mean, how can that in the end affect policy to try to, as George says, reverse the idea that basically we don't fish except in certain small areas? How can we use all that knowledge and AI to...
Well, I suppose AI is really just one of many useful tools when you're near the sea to see what's going on. You don't need it most of the time. But an example I saw a few days ago was somebody was a bird warden, I think, on the Farne Islands, looking at the migratory seabirds as they were coming in. And if you're there, you count them through your binoculars and you try and see, okay, how many kittiwakes have we got, or guillemots, or puffins? And he was using a video telescope and an AI tool that automatically identified all the different birds coming in. And that's really helpful on one level, and anybody can get a video telescope and get this app, for knowing what's here. So that can inform policy by, say, showing that puffin numbers drop tremendously when we allow sand eels to be... So citizen science there contributes to science. But the other thing is that citizen science contributes to citizens going to the sea and feeling that they have a role there in a community of other people that keeps drawing them back. And I think the main thing is not, this technological thing ticks one useful box. It's how do we re-engage and find our communities around each other in the ocean? Like, there are roles for anybody in this room in the sea or in rivers if they want to get engaged. It doesn't matter what your skill set or age is. The hardest thing is not deciding what to do, it's finding the other people who are doing it and linking up with them. So I think some of these tools, these AI tools, help you to go out, notice, share that with other people, and then you automatically get swept up. And then when people go cold water swimming, they're angry that the water's full of poo and that they all go and tell the government off. But I think you've got to feel you have a place there before you can advocate and contribute.
Absolutely. Tim, last one of these events we did it about energy, and Mike Berners-Lee spoke, and he put up a slide just showing that we've had 29 COPs so far, and that in that time, both oil and gas has gone up, the amount of coal being, CO2 coming into the atmosphere, and on top of that is all the renewable energy that's just adding to energy generally. And that was quite depressing, to put it mildly, to see that the knowledge is here, it's in this room, it's around this, on this panel, and yet the one mechanism we supposedly have doesn't seem to function for us.
No, it doesn't, but it isn't the only mechanism we have, is it? Because really, system change is exactly what it says on the tin. It's systemic. And why do we have a Climate Change Act in the UK, which we can all be proud of? Because of a backstory of decades of environmental action that manifests as a private members' bill that then gains, with that social movement behind it, the support to become written into law, a law that we should all be inordinately proud of. So even when we look at technology and the transformation that is happening and the good change that is happening in the energy system, we have to remember all kinds of actors have played a role in that. So whilst this picture might have not looked too optimistic from Mike, we're just at the point now where essentially, the more solar panels and wind turbines you make, the better they get and the cheaper they get. And the same is true of the batteries going in the electric vehicles. And now they've reached the point, especially with solar and wind, where they're the cheapest source of power worldwide. When you make a fair comparison, you count in for battery storage on the grid. And that's why they're on extraordinary exponential growth, solar in particular. The installed capacity worldwide is doubling less than every 2 years. I could give you numbers, but you'd glaze over because who knows, who can picture what, 600 gigawatts of added capacity last year looks like in terms of solar power, but it's pretty spectacular. So now we're at the point where solar is starting to displace coal, even in China, which we all demonize for, in our heads as if they were just the big coal burners. Actually, the picture is turning around. Where does the technology that come from? It comes from people who had a vision, who cared passionately about sustainable energy. In this case, 8 of the chief technical officers of 9 of the first solar startup companies in China came out of one lab of Martin Green's lab in University of New South Wales, where they were passionately developing the world record-breaking solar cells year on year. So tiny, small things sometimes make a big difference. That's the obvious message of tipping points. And it's also a message that don't just look to the top down. I mean, we'd all love for governance to act in the right way, but it doesn't happen like that. It happens because the bottom up, us, and the top down, sometimes clumsily or otherwise, come into what we might call synergy or some kind of feedback loop.
That's so optimistic and good thing to hear. That's a great kind of defeat of the idea that none of the COTS work. Does that make you optimistic, George? That notion that there's a good.
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot going on, but as you hinted at, talking about what Mike Berners-Lee was saying, what counts is not so much the good things we do as the bad things we stop doing.
Yeah.
And all the new solar installations, all the new wind power, all the other excellent technologies coming on stream will count only if we are retiring the old technologies. The fossil fuel, the internal combustion engines, all the other things that are trashing the planet. And unfortunately, that's the thing which isn't happening, or isn't happening at nearly a great enough speed. And of course, there's one thing we haven't mentioned today, which is Trump, who is doing everything he possibly can to reverse progress in the biggest and most powerful economy on Earth. And this, is just exactly what we don't need. It's the worst possible person at the worst possible time.
How much damage do you actually think he can manage to do in, let's say he does step down in 4 years and doesn't try and fight? Let's assume that he goes. How much damage do you reckon he can do?
Well, some of these things will continue. As Tim rightly says, in China, extraordinary things are happening. And it's outrageous that we've demonized the Chinese. It's a racist myth that the Chinese are the problem, unfortunately perpetrated by certain programs on TV here. It's gone on for far too long, this idea that, we're the good guys and they're the ones trashing the planet. It's completely wrong. It's absolutely outrageous. And unfortunately, some people still subscribe to that.
Thank you.
So we are seeing great shifts taking place. Even in this country, far too slow, and some of it, in some respects, we're going backwards with this crazy CCS program, carbon capture and storage, which is actually a new fossil fuel scheme disguised as a green solution. We'd like the Lower Thames crossing, which by itself will generate 6 million tons of extra carbon dioxide emissions and won't solve any of our problems. You know, some of these big infrastructure schemes are just there. Well, for two purposes, really. One, to generate contracts for powerful corporate lobbyists, and two, to allow ministers to pose beside them in hard hats and yellow jackets.
Gross.
Yeah, exactly. And so, you know, there's much, much more we need to do, and we need to be doing it much faster. And the key thing is not what we build, it is what we retire.
Yeah. So, before we bring in the audience, Helen, what do you do to stop deep-sea trawling? I mean, it seems to me there's a kind of massive sort of Wild West out there of impossibility to legislate and...
Yeah, it is very difficult. And actually, I might just take your question and pop it into a thing we haven't discussed tonight, just to briefly touch on deep-sea mining.
Yes, that would be...
And I think that, well, it really chimes in with what you were saying, George, about we've got to, it's the bad things we give up. We've got to give up bottom trawling, but we've got to not start deep-sea mining. The destruction of both is, I think, very equivalent. We're basically talking about just obliterating the seabed and everything that lives there, and all the critical things that this part of the ocean is doing for the planet and its livable planet that we inhabit. So for me, this is a really interesting time to be talking about, yes, trying to stop trawling in protected areas. But at the same time, also, there is a swing against this what some people are the narrative is being sprung of an absolute inevitability that we're going to mine the deep sea for metals to make wind turbines and batteries and so on for this green revolution that we need. And that is the only way it's going to happen. But actually, the real story is that there is increasingly pushback. And one of the things that did come out of Nice was more countries stepping up and saying we support a moratorium on deep-sea mining, because there is a chance, because of the way the situation and the deep sea in the high seas is regulated. We won't go into the details, but there is a possibility of just saying no. Mm-hmm. We actually could just say no. There are meetings coming up this year that we'll see whether that will happen. But it will be the first time a huge planet-destroying industry gets stopped before it starts, before we have to get to the point of going, oh, how do we control this? How do we pare this back? Once this juggernaut has started, it's going to be very hard to stop. But we do have a chance to stop it.
And so what do you say to the companies that say we need the stuff that we can find in order to power the green revolution? So
there are other ways we can do this.
Tim, you're shaking your head.
Pa is what I say to them. But then that's not...
And ba.
Yeah, exactly. No, that isn't true. I mean, there are legitimate concerns voiced widely about where are we going to get these critical metals for the batteries. But if you look at the numbers, the amount of extractive industry you need in this electrified future is a pretty small fraction of the one we have now. And in fact, they're so valuable, those metals, that they won't be put in the landfill anyway. There's already very high-tech recycling of everything from consumer electronics, including the batteries of EVs. So there is a very circular economy emerging there, and it's a much less materially demanding one. And of course, we should be concerned if it were anything that would create new harms, whether to the deep sea or to the itinerant cobalt miners of the Democratic Republic of Congo or whoever else. But you have to think about the scales of justice here, and the hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people who are already suffering and are set to suffer from ongoing climate change. We've got to try to lift that side of the scales. The art of good governance will not be to gratuitously create new harms in solving that, in alleviating that profound harm. But that harm we've got to alleviate is so stark and so huge that we must keep our sight on that kind of
So the other thing that we haven't mentioned is plastics in the ocean, which is something George and I have been talking about a lot, about microplastics getting into plants and getting into crops and now beginning to weaken the amount of fertility and all sorts of things. I mean, you must see it, Tom, a lot in what you do. I mean, the effects of plastic, not just tangling up in sea creatures, but microplastics running through the ocean.
Well, I don't measure plastics in the ocean, but I do see, I mean, anybody who goes, especially if you go to a beach or a rock that other people don't go to regularly, like some of the seabird colonies of Pembrokeshire, they're volunteers that have to go in with hazmat suits and clear out all of the fishing gear that's built up or the birds regurgitate to their young. In Nice, we went out and we saw a sperm whale and her calf, and then just after that, we found a bit of ghost gear that somebody had left, which is where fishers, you know, their equipment gets either lost or that it is thrown overboard. And but can I just totally dodge that question and answer something in my head, which is to your
jump
last
into
question.
anything.
To your last question about what can we do in deep sea mining? There's a woman here. Is Inga Relf here? Where's Inga? There. If you see that woman, she's called Inga Relf. Stand up, Inga. Sorry. Oh. Sorry, no, Inga won't mind, I'm pretty sure. Well, let's see. If you, like, Inga has been leading the charge for years to bring a moratorium against deep sea mining and the exploitation of the Arctic, the high Arctic. And that's what she's just been doing in Nice. I'm surprised that she's standing, having seen her schedule. So if you want to know what you can do, find her afterwards, and she will directly tell you what you can do and what she's been doing. But I'll let her do that, because I'll make a pig's ear of it. But a round of applause for Inga.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for what you're doing. And I wish we had a mobile microphone, because I could then get you to tell everybody, but everyone will have to find you afterwards. So let's come to some of these questions. George, something I suppose for you, given the importance of animals to farm soil health, what would happen if we stopped breeding them? Is it not better to eat less than eat none?
Well, I mean, what animals do is they recycle carbon into the soil, but the carbon has to be there in the first place. I mean, they're not making carbon which wasn't there. They're eating plants and pooping it out, and it goes into the soil. But if the plants died, that would also be going into the soil. I mean, we could massively reduce our agricultural area if we stopped eating animals. It's by far and away the huge proportion, 85% or so of all the agricultural area on Earth is for farming animals. And the biggest proportion of that is grass-fed animals. They are disproportionately environmentally damaging because of the vast opportunity cost that involves. Every hectare of land we use for our own purposes is a hectare of land which cannot support wild ecosystems. The great majority of wildlife species on Earth depend on wild ecosystems, but we now know that the Earth system as a whole depends on wild ecosystems. So perhaps the most damaging thing of all we do is to eat pasture-fed meat. And this sounds highly counterintuitive, because there's a massive movement with left-wing foodies on the one hand and fascists on the other hand, all saying we should be eating pasture-fed meat. On the one hand, because it puts us in touch with the land and it's good, and on the other hand, because this is the Paleolithic diet and it makes you into a real man. And it's an absolute catastrophe for the planet. I mean, if you take our soils, for instance, in the UK, what we call agricultural soils are woodland soils. The best places for agriculture is where there used to be forests. Now, obviously, we need to keep farming, we need to keep producing food, but we should do so with the minimum amount of land possible, because that allows us to conserve the maximum amount of nature. And what would happen on much of our farmland is the trees would come back, and then you would see not only much more carbon above ground, but also much more carbon below ground.
Well, that's, yeah, that would be good. I'm in favour of us eating more beans at the moment, because beans are very good for the soil. Question here about how fit for purpose is the MSC's certification framework. Do you know anything about it? Does anyone know anything about it, of how efficient it is? I've always been a bit dubious.
I've been ranting against it, but I've had my say, so
Yes, I mean, I had some things to say about it in one of the books I wrote, probably the one about the deep sea. There are problems with it. The certification sort of system tied up with who is earning money from it. And there are certainly some fisheries that have got labels that I would question. They don't sort of put a hard line on things like bottom trawling or deep sea trawling. I find it extraordinary that there's a species called the orange ruffy that is an incredibly long-lived fish. These things, some of them have been found to live for hundreds of years. They live in the deep sea on deep sea mounts, which are these incredibly fragile ecosystems. And we know that because when there's been trawling on these things decades ago, they look exactly, pretty much, depending on where you go, exactly in the world, but a lot of them just do not recover on the scale of decades. These are deep sea corals that take hundreds, thousands of years to grow, and they're just ripped out of the way to get to these fish, these century-old fish. And there are fisheries for that species that are given a certification as being sustainable, which just doesn't seem to compute in my mind. It all depends on your idea of what sustainability means. If we can, so it's difficult, and that's not the case for everything that's labelled under the MSC. But there definitely are problematic fisheries. For example, longline fisheries that are taking large amounts of bycatch. I think there's questions there. So it's difficult. I mean, I would say, choosing what to eat, what seafood to eat, is, if you do decide to do that, is not a straightforward matter. But there are other ways of finding better information. I'm more of a believer in looking at things like the Good Fish Guide, which is constantly updated. It's not a financial scheme. They're not trying to sell you fish. They're just trying to give you information about the better and worse choices. So if you do decide to keep on eating seafood, something like that will help you, I think, in a more genuine way.
Is that an industry-led certification?
No, it's just it's the Marine Conservation Society. They put it out, and I don't think it's connected to selling fish. I think it is independent. I think, So.
Okay. I just remind us of I think it's absolutely right, everything that's being said about industrialised fishing, and to us as a rich Western audience, I'd remind everybody of the majority world and the 500 million people who depend for their livelihoods on coral reefs, for example, most or a large fraction of whom would be itinerant fishing people. Yeah. Now, they're equally capable of trashing their fish stocks, by the way, but that's it's in the majority world where marine protected areas on coral reefs, it took some time to win the fishing people around to them, even where their fish stocks have crashed. But once they began to see, oh yes, the coral reef is where they're the natural spawning places for the fish, and there's spillover from the protected area into the surrounding waters, and then, wow, we can get our fishery back. Once that was realised from the 1980s onwards, with instances in the Philippines and in Kenya, that kind of marine preserve, that kind of new relationship between the people and their ecosystem has spread, and it's spread incredibly effectively, for example, across Pacific Islands. And whenever the community has ownership of those marine protected areas and the change in the way of fishing, that's when it spreads effectively, for example, seen in Fiji. So I think there's an important positive tipping point story there, because I'm kind of with George, and let's stop eating beef. But for those who want to still eat animal protein, well, bivalves from the ocean and fish is certainly a more efficient way to get your animal protein than anything on land. And you may say, who am I to say what those fishing people of the coral atolls and the global south should or shouldn't eat? But there is a sustainable way for them to have that relationship with a thriving, extraordinary ecosystem.
Tom, there's a question here very much for you about, are there different regional humpback whale languages, or can they all understand each other no matter where they come from?
Great question. This is something that's being looked into. There are differences in how humpbacks sing in different populations. What's not known is whether these are if the other vocalizations they make when they're not singing at the long, half-hour-long performances that individual whales, thought to only be males, do in the breeding, not the feeding season, where they'll sing for half an hour, and then a half an hour, and then a half an hour with little breaths in between. But most of whale communication is back and forth, listening, responding, small, short bursts, doing, like in humpbacks, things like bubble net feeding. Now, it's not known whether different vocalizations of different humpback whale populations are enough to class themselves as different communication systems or even different languages. There's a big argument about whether what they have is a language that I think is maybe a boring sidetrack, because they are able to express things like their own identity, what should we do next, what's happening, what am I worried about? And you can worry about whether that's a technical language or not, or you can think, wow, how amazing, maybe they differ. Dolphin populations have different dialects in different places around these islands. In New Zealand, the same small population of dolphins has different dialects within a few miles of each other. In Brazil, dolphins that collaboratively hunt with fishers for mullet, where the dolphins drive the mullet into nets and the fishers share the mullet with the dolphins, have a different dialect from the same species nearby that don't interact with humans. So our cultures shape their communication systems. And the dolphins that have those accents and dialects and that fish with the people, they live longer too. So there's a very interesting thing here if you just think, well, we are crap, aren't we? We should just get out the way. Actually, like, we can be useful functioning parts of other animals' ecosystems and their cultures. And I think this maybe speaks to a wider point, which is that as we are understanding that other animals might have things like cultures, ways of being and surviving that are unique to their communities, that they learn directly from watching and communicating with each other, then we have opportunities for diversity, but also opportunities for damage. Because when I was at university, you learned that if you just had 2 animals left and then you bred them all up again and they weren't inbred, then you'd won conservation. But what if you lose all the culture? What can be lost too? What resilience is there in these different strategies that orcas say have learned over thousands of years to wash seals off ice floes in Antarctica, ground themselves on beaches in Patagonia, rub their bellies on sandy gravel beds on the Pacific Northwest? These all took individuals trying new things, learning from each other, transmitting it for thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. And when those individuals die, that culture is lost. And you see this in fish. I mean, you're the expert on this, but like, do you want to tell the story about fish culture and herring?
Yeah, go on.
Oh,
wait.
Now
maybe...
you put me on the spot.
So sorry, I've jumped
I'll
to you.
let you tell that
Okay,
one.
sorry. So I hope I haven't got it wrong. I think it's herring. But basically, the herring have been getting lost recently on their migrations, and it's thought to be because the old ones knew where to go, and then and this isn't really culture, but they just watch each other and travel in the same direction. Maybe there's a cultural element. But because we fished out the old ones, the young ones don't know where to go anymore. And if you don't believe fish can remember things or follow each other or have relationships or have distinct knowledge bodies within their populations, you don't factor this into what is a marine certification for a sustainable stock. You just think fish or whale. And so we have this wonderful opportunity to see opening up before us realms of knowledge and relationship in the living world, but it's crushing because we've realized it's another way to mess it up too.
Yeah,
and the
George,
tuna are doing that too.
Really?
We think that that's why there's no bluefins coming back to the North Sea. One reason could again be this knowledge thing, that the old ones aren't there to say, hey guys, let's go, come back here.
Tom triggered something off in my mind when he talked about fisheries science, and I think we've got to recognise there's 2 completely different disciplines, and one is called fisheries science and one is called marine ecology. Yeah. But fisheries science has swarmed and overtaken marine ecology. And what fisheries science does is to say, what's the maximum sustainable yield of a fish stock? And what marine ecology says is let's look at fish populations and ecosystems within which they live, and they're totally different, and their outcomes are totally different. A marine ecologist might look back to what we know, and it's not a complete account of what the oceans might have been like before we started fishing them, and have a completely different baseline for ecological normality, whereas a fisheries science would say scientists would go back no further than the 1970s, the absolute maximum, and say, well, we've got to have a certain percentage of the population, of the stock, as they say, that it was then. And if there's more than that percentage, we'll call that, and these are the terms they use, underexploited or underfished. Yeah. Quite extraordinary. And basically fisheries scientists, with a few exceptions, are accountants working for the industry. It's in my view, a bogus science. It's not a real science. It's not a science rooted in planetary realities. It's rooted in commercial demands. And we have to recognize that these are separate disciplines, and we have to allow the marine ecologists to come out on top.
We're just about, I'm afraid, at the end of our time, but we have got a treat up our sleeve in the form of a wonderful film made by Tom to show everybody. But just before we go, if you can do one thing.
One thing.
Or two things.
We've covered so much already, but I think I'm going to come back to this idea of being ocean people. And I think all of us, no matter what we do, where we are, whether we can even get to the sea, we can lean into the awe and the wonder and identify as someone who cares for that, and then pass that on. So I think together we can make it normal to care for the ocean, and that will keep this momentum going, that we will not let it go out of sight and out of mind again. So make caring for the ocean, make being an ocean person normal. Do that yourself, get it in other parts of your life, friends and family too, and I think that is wonderful, and it ties into what Tom was saying about citizen science. If you can get yourself down there, that's a very powerful way of doing it, but there's other ways too. Watch the documentaries, read the books, talk about it, make it normal.
George?
From the top of the river catchment in the mountains to the deepest ocean trench, let's take the ecological perspective. Let's look at what these ecosystems once were and what they could be, and try to maximize the ecological abundance and diversity of the whole hydrological system, on fresh water and salt water, and rewild them to the greatest extent possible.
It is interesting that, we have tons of books about what the Earth used to look like, and dinosaurs or whatever it was. We have nothing about what the sea might have looked like.
The first chapter of my book.
Okay, good.
And Helen Roberts' fantastic and unnatural history of the sea. It's a it's a magnificent book.
Thank you for that.
It has to be read. And what we had around here, these were the most abundant seas in the world.
Yes.
There were halibut the size of barn doors right by the coast. There were Edward Goldsmith in 1776 described the arrival of the herring, these huge shoals, many, many miles long, with all the huge sharks. You could see them because the North Sea was clear, because there were solid oysters all the way across to Germany.
You don't have to go back that far. My dad can remember it.
Yeah, and then the sperm whales coming in to eat the herring. Yeah. All this within sight of the shore. This is what we could have again.
Tom?
Is it what you can do?
Yeah, what can we all do?
I suppose I would just reiterate what I said before and just think it's for you. You can do it, and the way to figure out what you particularly should do is to find the bit of it that you like the most and then find the other people doing stuff there. But the nice thing is you find the bit you like the most and those people by going there. You don't physically have to go. The person who wrote the algorithm that runs Happy Whale lives in South Korea and has never even been to the sea or seen a whale.
That's great.
The bit of the sea that he likes the most is designing algorithms that identify whales in it and hanging out with the other people who do that. So, and I would say, incredibly cheekily, that if the thing you like in the sea is understanding why dolphins bow ride, then support my PhD, which I'm just about to do, and then you can come and do that with me.
Okay. And Tim, what do we do?
Well, if you haven't had it already, I think the deepest tipping point is the one in our own worldviews, where we realise this is our life support system. We can only be here after 4 billion years of evolution because it created the oxygen-rich atmosphere, the equable climate, the cycling of all the elements we need to flourish. And And once you've got that, got Gaia in simple terms, a lot else can follow. But I honestly think we need a social movement to change our economic thinking. If we don't, we need to recognize that in our life support system, we're dealing with something which the economists would describe as not substitutable. You can't go and buy something in the marketplace to give you that atmosphere to breathe and all the other things we fundamentally depend upon. And even basic economics will tell you, if you recognize that, you should actually value it disproportionately highly. It's common sense. And yet we do not enact that. Arthur Dasgupta has done a gentle and important job in trying to push thinking in this direction, but we need a social movement behind that to overturn the crazy economics that's still driving us into the apocalypse.
Couldn't agree more. I'm going to say thank you very much to all our speakers now, and then we're going to show the film, and then basically the end of the evening. But I think you will enjoy the film very much. But in the meantime, please give a big round of applause to Tim and to Tom and to George and to Helen. Will be on sale out in the foyer. Thank you all very, very much for coming, and see you again soon.